Welcome on Wild Voices, our podcast on animal research, animal conservation, animal welfare. And today we are very happy to welcome two very important guests. We will talk about science, we will talk about killer whales and acoustics. Welcome, Volker. Welcome, Hannah. Very nice to have you here. First, I would like to know a little bit, Volker. You are known internationally for your work on killer whales. So what is your background? What is your topic?
It's a bit of a roundabout way getting into underwater acoustics of killer whales. I come from a landlocked nation, grew up in Austria, but first really came in contact with the species at a research station in British Columbia that did underwater monitoring, Orca Lab, and there were speakers everywhere. Even the campground had a speaker, the kitchen, and you were constantly immersed in the underwater sounds of the sea. And then once in a while the whales came by, and it was just this, wow, this is amazing. I had no idea what's going on under the waves, that there are these intricate sounds that we can hear, that we can analyze. And then I was hooked. Yeah.
I can imagine. That's a good way to start a career. Huh?
Absolutely.
We welcome also Hannah. So Hannah, introduce yourself and let us know what you are doing here in Lolo Parque.
Yeah, so basically I'm starting a PhD. We're looking at the bioacoustics of the killer whales here at Loro Parque. So we've got the captive population, we've got this huge data set going back to 2005, and we've got so much that we want to do with it. First sort of thing is creating a catalogue of the calls. So basically what each individual whale, the call types they make, sort of comparatives in the wild, and looking at that. And then there's loads of really cool analysis that we're hoping to do.
Oh, that's great. You're very welcome. Very interesting project. For listeners who are not very familiar with killer whale acoustics, can you let us know a little bit more how important are vocalization for these animals?
It's really everything they do to communicate almost. If you think of it, they live underwater. Vision is very limited. Even in tropical waters, 100 meters is pretty far. But, in Iceland or British Columbia, where these animals live, visibility underwater is often 10 meters or 3 meters, whereas sound travels freely. And so they use sound in the form of echolocation to navigate through the passages. They use sound to communicate, so they make these pulsed calls that have group-specific dialects in many cases, and they use whistles, and those are often used in close-range encounters when the animals are interacting with each other.
That's very interesting, and maybe we could add some of these sounds on the podcast, so our listener would have a hint about what they are producing as sounds. We will go now a little bit more deeper on what we know today, and I'm pretty sure there are still so many things to discover, and that's why you're here with us, Anna. But many times we hear when people are talking about killer whales that they have dialects. Can you let us know a little bit more about what is behind this dialect concept?
Okay, so first of all, every population of killer whales, be that Icelandic herring-eating killer whales, Norwegian herring-eating killer whales, British Columbia mammal-eating killer whales, they all have their own set of calls. So from a quick recording, 5 minutes of recording, we can tell, okay, this is a group of Icelandic killer whales, or this is a group of Norwegian killer whales. Much like, you can tell a human from their voice and the way they pronounce things, where they come from. And we can do exactly the same with killer whales. So every population has dialects, but in some populations it goes even further. So the northern residents, the southern residents in the North Pacific, for example, every family group has its own acoustic badge. And for my master's, that's what I studied. And I can tell you exactly from a few minutes of recording, this is, A12 matriline, a group of, 18 animals. And because that's what the sounds that they make, and they put a little upsweep on this call type. And so, I know that this is A12.
So I can imagine that you are one of the very rare human being on this planet being able to, from the sound of killer whale, to tell, okay, this guy is coming from this part of the world. That's fascinating.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Do you know how, and I think it's about the work that Anna will do with you and us here, and how flexible these vocalizations are, because they have dialects, but is it flexible?
There are instances in the wild where one group occasionally, very occasionally, copies the calls of another group. So they have vocal learning. They can learn new sounds. You can train killer whales in captivity to produce new sounds, and that's something quite unusual for mammals. At least there aren't that many mammals that can flexibly modify their vocalizations like humans are definitely a species. Primates, chimpanzees, for example, don't really have that ability, and all the studies that try to speak to teach chimpanzees to speak, they all failed. They're very good with gestural communication, and so sign language worked very well, but they don't have the vocal apparatus and the brain wiring to actually modify their vocalizations. Killer whales are extremely good at that, and most of the other cetaceans, bottlenose dolphins, other dolphin species can do that too.
Yeah, very interesting. And I can also add that it's a sign in the direction of Rafael Zamora, our friend that is working on parrots here in Lolo Park a lot, that some birds also are very good at that. It's very interesting. Okay. So we know more now on these animals, but when you discuss with people, do you see quite often that there is some misconceptions about this ability to communicate? This language, communication, dialect. So some people might think they speak. What do you think about it?
It's not a language as we know it. I think it's very important that we don't transfer our experience onto these animals. Their life is very different. But it's very clear that these calls are very important. They're very important for signaling identity. Other killer whales in the area, probably from 30 kilometers away, can tell whether a distant group is part of their population or belongs to a different group, can then make decisions, okay, we want to join them or not. So that's definitely important. But then it could also be that the calls are used to synchronize behaviors in the group, that when the animals are resting, one animal starts making what we call a resting call, and the others either then also start making resting calls and the whole group sort of goes quiet, or they don't, and they decide, no, I'm not ready to rest yet. So behavioral coordination is definitely another important function, but it's not a language as we know it. That we don't have evidence that it's the transmission of abstract concepts like our words, for example, and the sort of structure suggests that that's not what's going on.
Okay. So, and we have to respect that every species has its own communication system, and the human one is not the paramount. Of course. Very interesting. Let's go now to discuss a little bit more about conservation issues. So we know that these animals can stay in the same place or travel a lot, and most of the time they live in the vicinity of human activities. Mm-hmm. So can you tell us more about the conservation challenges that they are facing?
Okay, so I think the big challenges underwater are, in the sea is food abundance. Some of the killer whale populations are extremely specialized. We've got populations in Canada, the US that specialize on effectively one species of salmon, and if those salmon runs are good, the whales are doing good, and if those salmon runs are not doing well, that will affect those whales immediately. So food abundance is really important. But then also, they don't just need to have food, they need to be able to find their food. And these particular killer whales use echolocation to find their food. If there's noisy ships about or other industrial noise in the environment, they may struggle to detect the salmon, and whereas in a quiet ocean, they can detect a salmon 200 meters away, if it's very noisy, that radius or that distance may shrink to 50 meters, and that obviously then translates into reduced foraging success.
That's something. I also heard that, for example, there is a nice work done on dolphins that also to communicate between each other. Some dolphins are forced to reduce the size of the communication, the range of frequency they use because we are making too much noise. And I can imagine that for killer whales, it might be the same.
Absolutely. You've got these very stable family groups. You've got calves in there that need to stay with their group. If they become separated, that could be really problematic. And they're using calls to keep in touch with each other. And again, noise can affect their ability to hear each other, and that could then mean that individuals become separated, can't find each other again. So it's definitely something we need to pay very close attention to, underwater noise pollution.
So that brings me to your work that you are doing, the acoustic study of vocalization and how they communicate has a very important conservation value then.
Absolutely.
Yeah, that's very important, I think. Do you see, for instance, since acoustic is so important for them, acoustic monitoring is a powerful tool for conservation?
Absolutely, because we can use sound to track the animals rather than following them in boats. We can put remote hydrophones out, collect them a year later, and analyze all the sounds and say, okay, this particular group or this particular population has been detected in this area, and that allows us obviously to define their habitat. Where do they go to forage, for example? We can look from the echolocation behavior. We can see whether they're successfully foraging or not. And so we can use sound to identify critical feeding habitat, for example.
That's fascinating.
There's also the cool use when they're sort of using it to identify where the whales are. So sort of human-animal conflict. So I know that in a couple of cases, killer whales will get fish off long lines, off fishermen, and they're using the acoustics to be this population of killer whales that likes stealing fish is in this area, and then they can let the fishermen know, which helps.
And so they can adapt. Yeah, it's all about human-animal interaction and how we can share the same space in a good way for both of us. That's very interesting.
It's a very good non-invasive way to track the animals. You don't have to put tags on them or anything. All you need to do is put an underwater microphone out, and if the whales are in the area, you're going to find out.
Yeah, and I think that's an approach we have in common. The work you're doing and the Loropaca Foundation, we are very invested in protecting the Iberic orca, and colleagues of ours, Javier Almunia, published recently a paper. We were with him yesterday in the lab discussing about project and so on. And Anna, you make him remember about this publication that was very recent of putting a boy in the sea, listening to the animals, and then the surprise on. Well, don't say it's a surprise, but the noise recorded that we do was covering most of the vocalization of these animals. So it's important data. Huh?
Absolutely. And it's exciting because for the first time we now have their acoustic signature. So we can use passive acoustic monitoring to now see if we pick up those same call types again elsewhere, we know these are the Iberian orcas.
Yeah. And I heard they are traveling sometimes to Brittany in France on the coast.
Yes, definitely.
Playing also a little bit with boats there. We have many things in common, and now we are cooperating together. Can you let us know a little bit more about the collaboration we have and the opportunity it is for you to work with us?
Okay. The problem we have in the wild, a lot of things are unknown. We often don't see the animal as they're making their calls. We have very limited information on social interactions. And working at Loroparque gives us the opportunity to look at the animals as they're communicating with each other, and identify which individual is actually making a given call, how others respond to that call, and effectively linking the social environment, the social behavior with the acoustic communication, which is super exciting.
Yeah, that's interesting. I used to say, when you put a mic in the water, you hear the conversation,
exactly.
but you don't know who is talking with who is answering, and so on. And working in a zoological setting provide much more information that complete what we can record in the wild. So it's a ex situ, in situ, back and forth movement.
It's very complementary.
Yeah. There are some people that sometimes question the relevance of the data collected in zoos. Do you have an opinion on that?
I think, we need to approach communication from all angles, and there's certainly very relevant things that we can find out here. How calls develop over time, as a young animal joins a new social group, for example. That's something that we can probably only examine with animals in human care, but then obviously we can use that to make inferences about what happens in the wild during that very important socialization process.
Yeah, again, it's the back and forth.
Exactly.
Yeah, and people working on both fields.
I think like a really interesting example of how we can sort of link these rare behaviours to acoustic events is we were watching Tino and Morgan the other day, and he was feeding from her, and in the wild this is really rare, and it's hard to see because they're under the water, whereas in human care we really get this exclusive view of it, and we can link it to acoustics, which is brilliant.
Yeah, very interesting. It reminds me of some colleagues have done also research on belugas, and they were a little bit concerned about not knowing what is the necessary kilocalorie income a calf needs to survive in the wild. And it has been studied in zoos, and they were able to provide the country interested with the data, and then it was turned into a law to protect the animal at a certain time when they needed this energy, because we knew how much they need. So this back and forth between the wild and zoos is always the best. Anna, now it's a little bit more your turn. It's your PhD project. Yeah, you will start with us under the supervision of Volker. So yesterday it came clear to me that you will have a lot of work. And can you tell us more why you will have so much work related to the data that we will provide to you?
Okay, so we've got this amazing data set going back to 2005, so about 20 years of vocal recordings, continuous recordings of the animals' calls, which is honestly too much data, but it's a nice problem to have. And so the main sort of things of the project is, the first thing we're looking at is creating a catalogue of calls for these animals, specifically looking at the individuals. So we do have a catalogue for this captive group by Javier in about 2015, looking at the whole population. So we're looking to add in orcas that weren't included, like Morgan and Tino, and then also look at the individual repertoires, and then we can do some really interesting analysis. I think some of the things I'm especially interested in are sort of the social context of the calls, so which animals were interacting when they happened, and also looking at perhaps diurnal effects, so difference between daytime and nighttime, which is an interesting one because the cameras don't show the whales at night. So we'll figure that out. And then we can go on to compare them to the wild populations. So Morgan is Norwegian, and then we've got Tekoa and Adan, which are a mix between Icelandic populations and Pacific populations, which is really interesting because in the wild these wouldn't interact. So if there is a genetic component, and we think it's mostly social learning, but it'll be really interesting to see what happens there. And then hopefully we'll get to take this social context and everything we've learned from captivity and go and look at some wild orcas and really see how what we've learned in captivity translates into the wild, informing conservation and our knowledge on them, which would be amazing.
So Anna, can you tell us more how you got the job, and do you have any advice for young people sharing this podcast with us that would like to do the same? It's a dream project that you have. So how you came there?
Honestly, I'm still pinching myself and I'm waiting for Volker to be like, why are you here? But yeah, it's really about persistence. It's animal studies in general is really competitive. And I'd say the one main thing is experience really makes difference. And that doesn't have to be going to Africa and doing a year there. You can get involved in sort of like local projects. So there's loads of free apps that you can use, especially for birds, to sort of identify the calls, photo identification. One of my first projects was on owls in my master's, and there's this online database where people upload all of their calls, and you've got this brilliant citizen science project, and you can do your whole project from this free online database and look at some really interesting trends across the whole world. So I'd really say, if you are interested in it, look for sort of degrees with placements. That's really helpful. And just try and get involved in everything that you can.
Yeah, I would also say there are nice conferences where young students can attend as volunteers and help in science, like the European Association for Aquatic Mammals is having one in March, for example, and many scientists comes, and we have young scientists like you, Anna, coming and learning from old scientists like us, Volker, I'm sorry. And,
no, it's extremely important. You know, these animals need the best ambassadors that we can get, and it's really important, you know, opportunities to get young, bright minds like Anna involved in bioacoustics, underwater research. These are specialty skills that we need for the future to look after these animals.
Yeah, there's still so many things to discover, and they need so much help in the wild, so it's very important. To finish the podcast, we spoke a lot about science and so on, but I would like to know more about emotion. And do you have a specific, both of you, souvenir, something that really you will never forget about these animals? Of course, you might have more anecdotes, Volker, and a little bit less, and you are building them now. But what about something that you will never forget about marine mammals?
I remember when I was doing my PhD, I was studying the mammal-eating killer whales in British Columbia, and the first eye-opener was, you know, I thought I could just study them, put hydrophones down, get a lot of recordings. These animals are so silent. But I do remember, you know, following this group for 8 hours. They didn't make a single sound because they're stealth hunters.
8 hours.
Yes, you know, they're usually trying to sneak up on seals. And then I was following them in the boat. They came in a junction between two channels, entered a new acoustic space, and as soon as they made the turn, they just exploded. They started breaching, they started tail slapping, they started, you know, hitting the water with the pectoral fins, and underwater, these really loud, very beautiful calls. And I was going, what is going on here? And then we followed them for another couple of hours, and all of a sudden 3 other animals showed up. And I was in contact over the marine radio with a colleague of mine who was with another group 30 kilometers away. And he said, wow, you know, 3 more animals. That can't be the group that I have been with, because to get there that fast, they would have had to speed swim. And sure enough, it was those animals. And when we compared notes at the end of the day, you know, it was clear that his animals started vocalizing after a marine mammal kill right at the time as ours were making the turn into that new channel. And the only way I can explain is these animals then, deciding to join up is through the calls. So they must have heard each other over that distance. And for me, that was a real eye-opener, how important sound is in their lives, that they need to be able to detect each other over those distances and, communicate, coordinate their movements, get together for mating, socializing. Those are all really important things. So, sound is not just chatter. It's a really essential life process for them. Yeah.
Fantastic anecdote. Thank you. So, Anna?
Well, I obviously don't have as many to choose from, but the one that really stands out to me is when I came to Laura Parke earlier this week, we got to meet the animals, and I was looking through this window and Adan swims past and he stops right in the window and looks straight at me, and they've got the eyes on the side of their head, and he's looking at me, and all I can think is like, this isn't just an animal passively swimming past and being like, that's a human. He was interested in me and being like, well, what are you doing staring at me? And I'm staring at him, and it was just like really amazing, and I could just think like, this is what I want to do.
Perfect. We are so happy to have you both with us. We will work together, we will study together. We have plenty of work. You have plenty of work to do, Anna, and I would like to invite you in 3 years, when you submit and you present your PhD, to share with us the results of this work. That would be fascinating. Thank you so much for all this information. I hope you enjoyed it, and we will meet again soon to discuss again about cetaceans, conservation, welfare, and all these topics that we are very much involved here in Loro Park with the Foundation. Bye-bye, everyone.